Shalom, how's everyone doing? Today is day 6 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and we'll be learning Siman Aleph, Seif Vav. Let's get right into it. Mizmorei Tehillim, Kapelach of Tehillim, V'chein Shar Parshios Mitor Nevi'im Uksuvim, or other Parshios from Tanakh, She'enam Shigurim B'fi Hakol, that aren't like familiar amongst everybody, Lo Amram Bal Peh, to recite them by heart, Afilu Mishu Yodei Lo Amram Bal Peh, even if somebody personally knows how to say it by heart, Yesh Lo Lizahir Shelo Lo Amram Bal Peh, a person should be careful and not say these psukim by heart. V'suma mutar. But if he's blind, he's able to. Okay, so this is a major sugya. The Kitzur summed it up in 3 lines, but there's a major sugya and we'll get into it. So there is a Gemara, Maseches Gin, Daf Samech, that quotes a seer of psukim. One pasuk says that Torah is supposed to be b'chsav, it's supposed to be written down. The other pasuk says Torah is actually Bal Peh, it's by heart. So the Gemara comes down and it says the line of Tvarim shebichsav I ata rashi lamra Bal Peh. If something's supposed to be written down, for example, it's Aleph Tanakh is supposed to be written down. I ata rashi lamra Bal Peh. Any pasuk, right? Psukim are supposed to be written down. You cannot recite psukim Bal Peh. That's what comes out from the Gemara. You're not allowed to recite psukim Bal Peh. So before we get into that, we have to ask ourselves, why is that? What's the isser? What's the problem? So there's a few reasons given. We'll quote 2 of them. One is the Ran Maseches Megillah. The Ran Maseches Megillah says the reason is because if you actually look at a pasuk, sometimes it's not the same way we read it out, right? Because sometimes it's missing a letter, sometimes there's an extra letter, sometimes there's a different word written, and we just like totally say a different word. So if you don't recite the pasuk from a ksav, you're missing out like the whole picture. You're missing out the whole thing. Like you're just saying it, but there's like more to the story. So that's the Ran's reason for this isser. The Radbaz in a Tshuva, he gives a different reason for the isser, and he says because we want to imitate, when we learn, we want to imitate the way the Torah was given. Right, so Torah Shebechsav was given. Torah Shebechsav was given from a ksav. Therefore, we try to imitate it as much as we could, and we say that it's actually aser to say psukim not from a ksav. Okay, so those are just 2 reasons, and now we'll get to some heterim. Right, so the first heter is from the Mordechai in Maseches Gin, and he basically asks a question, and he wants to know. He's like, okay, fine. The Gemara says it's aser to say psukim by heart. Great. But he says we see every day people are already saying Kriya Shema by heart, right? The Eishel Rami Bachash says, well, you're going to say this is just like a bad minhag? Like, no, it goes back to the times of the Gemara that they were saying Shema by heart, right? The Gemara talks about that they would cover their eyes and say Shema. How can they do that? They're saying it by heart. So the Mordechai answers, and he quotes Rabbeinu Tam, and he says, Migras Grisen. He says, no, there's any pasuk that's like super learned, like a pasuk that everybody knows, that is not included in the isser of saying psukim by heart. And he proves this from a different halacha, that there's a halacha usually when a sofer writes a sefer Torah, he has to have another sefer Torah in front of him to use, so before he would write every word, he would look at this other sefer Torah. But this halacha is not true when it comes to tefillin and mezuzos. Why? Same thing. When it comes to tefillin and mezuzos, these parshios are very well known, so there's no need to have another, a sofer doesn't have to look at another text when he writes down tefillin and mezuzos, because these are very normal parshios people know, like the parshios of the Shema. So the Mordechai, he wants to say that same thing applies by our halacha of Devarim Shebechsav Yata Rashi Lamra Bal Peh, that if it's a pasuk that is totally known, that everybody knows it, there's no isser to say the pasuk by heart. Okay, so that will be heter number 1. Heter number 2 is a heter that the Torah quotes b'shem the Rosh. The Torah quotes b'shem the Rosh that the only problem of saying psukim by heart is when you're using that pasuk to be motzi somebody else. For example, right, we have something called Kriyas HaTorah, right, that one person, right, everyone's chayav to, hear every pasuk in the Torah. So the question is, how does he do that? So, okay, one person gets up there and reads it for everybody. And that's okay. He's being motzi everybody. There in that specific case, when you're using a pasuk to be motzi somebody, there it has to be written from ksav. there has to be from a text. As opposed to somebody reciting a pasuk on his own, then if a person is reciting a pasuk on his own according to this, he really doesn't have to read it from a ksav. So what comes out according to the Rosh, that really you can read any pasuk you want by heart. Right? This Gemara is only talking about specific situations where one person is reading a pasuk for somebody else. So the question really is, which is the Iker Heter? What do we hold like? So if you look actually in the back of the Kitzur, he has footnotes on himself, and he writes that this Shita of the Rosh, that this Isser only applies if you're reading Pesukim for other people, is not just the Shita of the Rosh. It's actually also the Shita of the Rambam and the Rif. Why does the Kitzur think that? Because he says, you have to look where the Rambam and the Rif bring down this halacha. You know where they bring down this halacha? They bring it down in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah. So they bring in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah. Obviously they hold that the Isser isn't just for somebody learning by himself to read Pesukim by heart. It's only when it's by a Kriyas HaTorah, when you're being motzi people in Pesukim, that's when there's halacha, you have to read it from a ksav. So that's why the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch finds Shulchan Aruch a little interesting. Because if you look in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Mem Tes only quotes the heter of the Mordechai, right? He only quotes the heter of, if you know Pesukim, you're allowed to, if it's something totally known by everybody, then you're allowed to say it by heart. Anybody who knows anything about Shulchan Aruch, he always passes like the Rambam, Rif, and the Rosh. So what's going on here? So I saw Rav Asher Weiss as a piece about this topic, about Dvarim Shebechsav, and he says it's not fair. Shulchan Aruch just wants to, give a heter, right? You have to look at the context of Shulchan Aruch. He's discussing why people say Parshas Tamid Baal Peh, right? He's talking about in Hilchos Karbanos, that people say the Parsha of the Tamid Baal Peh. So he's explaining that, that's a heter, that everyone knows it, but he's not rejecting the heter of the Rosh. Maybe he even agrees with that. And if you look at the Mishnah Berurah in the same Siman Mem Tes, Seif Kan Vav, he basically quotes the Tshuva of the Chavos Yair. The Chavos Yair holds that really you could say Tehillim Baal Peh, and Tehillim is just Tefillah. And then the Mishnah Berurah goes, he's like, anyway, it's, we could rely on the Shitos that it's only a problem if you're being mostly other people. Okay, fine. So for now, that's an assumption we'll take. That really the Isser only applies if you're being mostly other people. But we have to understand, even though that's a major kula, that you could say any pasuk by heart, it's also a little bit of a chumrah. Why is it a little bit of a chumrah? It's like what the Torah himself says, right? The Torah here is talking a little bit about Birchas Kriyas Shema, right? It used to be that the Chazan would get up, he would say all of Birchas Kriyas Shema aloud, everyone would listen, they'd say Amen, and that's great. That's how they'd be Yotzei their Chiyuv to say Birchas Kriyas Shema. But the problem is, we say a couple psukim Birchas Kriyas Shema, right? We say, Mi chamocha b'elam Hashem, Hashem yimloch l'olam vad. These are psukim. So how can the Chazan get up there and say psukim for everybody? Right? Let's say he's not using a ksav, right? So, how can he be motzi everybody? So that's why the Torah says, so everyone has to say those psukim together with the Chazan, right? They could listen to the rest of the bracha. The rest of the bracha is not a pasuk. They could listen to the rest of the bracha from the Chazan, but these psukim they have to say to themselves, right? And even though these psukim are commonly known, right? We don't have we're saying we don't have the heter of the Mordechai, right? If we had the heter of the Mordechai, then we could just say, these psukim are well known, but we can't use both heterim at once, right? So if we're using the heter of the Rosh, it turns out it'd be a little bit of a chumrah that we would make these people say these psukim together with the Chazan. Before we go on a little bit, we have to really ask ourselves, what is considered a ksav, right? What is, when we say Devarim Shebechsav, Yetorah Shalom Rav Peh, what is a ksav? So, Pashut Pshat is just anything written. But the Chasam Sofer says not so Pashut. The Chasam Sofer, this is in Siman Sameches of Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, or Achaim. He writes that in order for something to be a ksav, it has to be written in the same way it would be written in a Sefer Torah, right? In the piece of Chasam Sofer is talking about Kriyas HaHaftorah. He wants to know, let's say somebody's reading the Haftorah from a Chumash. So, let's say we're assuming like the Rush that, to be motzi other people, you have to read from a Ksav. So, is a Chumash considered a Ksav? So you would think, yeah. Right? And the Shulchan Aruch says, Yeah, Pasha, of course it is. But the Chasam Sofer says it's probably not. Why? Because a Chumash doesn't have the Tzuras Osios, right? If you look in the Sefer Torah versus a Chumash, the letters look different, right? If you look in the Sefer Torah, there are something called Tagin, there are crowns in the letters, and the Sefer Torah is going to be makbid to have the Chaseros and the Yiseros, right? If there's an extra Yud in there, it's going to have it. And our Chumashim just don't have that. So the Chasam Sofer thinks that all our Chumashim really have a din of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So that's just an interesting ha'ara. And one last thing that the Poskim Bismanino are really dealing with is they want to know, what do we do Friday night? What do we do Friday night? We say Kiddush. Okay, great. You say Kiddush, one person says it for everybody, but before we say Kiddush, we say Psukim Vayichulu. So the real question is, Vayichulu or Psukim, we're reciting the Psukim for everybody. How do we do that? How do we motzi people in Psukim if we're not using Ksav? So what's the easy answer? So the easy answer is what the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa says. He says, in Echanami, you should use a Ksav. Okay, that's what he says. But the Tzitz Eliezer, he has a Chiddush to be matzdik the Minhag Olam. He goes through a few options. We'll just read one. But he says, why do we say Vayichulu Friday night? We say it because we're giving Edus that Hashem created the world. That's why we say it standing up. We're giving Edus. The number one rule of Edus is Mipihem velo mipi ksavam. That when somebody gives Edus, he's actually not allowed to use a ksav. He has to say it by heart. So the Tzitz Eliezer wants to argue. He says, yeah, true. Usually you have a rule that when you're being motzi somebody in Psukim, you can't say it by heart. But the one exception is, maybe there's more exceptions, but the one exception is Vayichulu, because Vayichulu, the takana was to give Edus, and Edus is said by heart. Okay, so that's a nice way to look at it. Okay, shkoyach.